To start out with the meet. You online, please mute yourself, raise your hands, and we'll try to keep track of. So starting out, we'll do a roll call. So I'm going to walk through here. Stephen Fedrick, here. Tom Roberts, Susan Katz, Justin Iverson, Ken Niles, here. Mary Lou Shows,
here. And my the audio from you keeps cutting out. If it keeps persisting, I may go to audio only because it may be challenging my bandwidth.
Aaron Ashley, Mia Burke,
Here.
Laura Feldman,
Here.
Jim Doherty.
Here.
And we have 4 legislators. They're in session, so I don't believe they're joining us. Rep. Levy, Rep. Sanchez, Senator Gorsuch, Senator Hansel, and here, so Max Woods, here, Aunt Cecilia,
Here.
Matt Hendrickson,
Here.
Mark Reese, here, Sarah Lovegang,
Here.
and then I've got Dan Solitz,
Here.
Shelley Simone, and Shelley Simone.
Can I see if Karen Power is on the line from the Oregon Governor's Office?
At
Okay.
this time, I'm not showing them.
So other attendees here today, we'll start with people in the room. So if your name has been called, if we could just start over here.
EPA. Brian Harkins, DOE. Department of Energy.
Harry Under.
Department of Ecology, Washington.
Jacob Williams, Washington State, Department of Ecology.
David Greenblatt, Communities.
Good morning, Lorraine Contreras, the Acclimation Near WM.
Okay, I think that's everyone in the room. Should we go through the people online?
You asked them name and affiliation in the chat.
So online, if you could type your name and affiliation in the chat box, so we've got a record. Great.
And Mary Lou has a question.
Mary Lou?
Yeah, you guys, the audio from you keeps cutting out. I'm going to have to go to audio only because I don't think my bandwidth is covering this. So can I just sign off and then sign back on, or how do I do that?
You can just try turning off your video,
Yeah.
seeing if that works. There's also an option to turn off incoming video.
There, your video just stopped. Can you hear us better now?
Well, we'll see. It was totally on or totally off for a few seconds each time. We'll see how that goes. I'm not sure how you turn off the incoming video.
It's an option under the 3 dots.
Oh, right. Okay, thank you.
And if you're in the room, the owl is doing all of our audio for the online folks. So try to talk towards this thing in the middle of the room here.
No. Okay,
Thank
the
you.
next business is to approve the minutes from the last meeting. Mark Reese sent those out shortly after the last meeting, so without objection, the meetings are approved. Are there any objections, comments, or changes? Hearing none, the meeting minutes from the last meeting are approved. The next order of business is Laura Feldman will offer a land acknowledgement.
Good morning, everyone.
We respectfully acknowledge that our advocacy, activism, and learning takes place on lands we inhabit throughout Oregon and Washington, cared for by Indigenous tribes and bands since time began. The Hanford nuclear weapons site encompasses culturally significant lands belonging to the Wanapum tribes and bands of the Yakama Nation, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Nez Perce Tribe, and the Spokane Indian Reservation. We acknowledge the economic and social values, including systemic racism, classism, and the disregard for Indigenous, Black, and immigrant communities that made harm to this place possible. The interconnectedness of the people, the land, and the natural environment cannot be overstated. The health of one is necessary for the health of all. We recognize the pre-existing and continued sovereignty of these their traditional ecological knowledge and perspective on how we might care for one another and the land. We are honored to be guests here. We commit to working towards cleanup and restoration of tribal use and stewardship of these lands, these waters.
Thank you, Laura. We do have time for public comment at 2:15 this afternoon toward the end of the meeting. So we will be happy to entertain any comments from the public at that time. And so now we're going to transition to the main topic of the day, and that's a panel discussion on the future use of the Hanford site. So Stephen Bedrick, the Oregon Hanford Cleanup Board Vice Chair, is going to facilitate the panel discussion. So over to you, Stephen.
All right, thank you. So I think what we want to try and do is have our panelists kind of gather at that table over there at the end so that we can see them. Maybe I should, maybe I'll introduce who our panelists are, and then as they're introduced, they can migrate to the table at the end. Does that work? Yeah, all right. So we've got a really wonderful group today. We have Brian Harkins from the DOE, and then Graham Wells from Ecology, and Fram from EPA, and Lorraine Contreras from the Yakama Nation. I believe Kermit Van Killer is on the phone with Nez Perce, hopefully, and then there's like from Trident. Sorry for if I butchered everyone's names. And while we're getting situated, oh yes, so the structure that we're going to have is everybody will have a chance to speak for a few minutes about their perspective and their group's sort of notion of where the use of the site, what the ultimate kind of use of the site might look like. So it may seem really far away. It is really far away, but it's also never too early to start thinking intentionally about where things go. That might, shape how the choices and thoughts we make today. So.
Apology that John Price online.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, my misunderstanding. So
those of you in the back of the room, there's room at the table, so feel free to join us.
And if you're on the phone only and you're muted, you can hit *6 to unmute if you have a question.
Yeah. And yeah, so maybe I believe everybody had a chance to put together some prepared thoughts. So what I thought we'd do is maybe kind of go in order, and then we will have transition to more of a discussion period kind of thing. We've got some discussion questions, and of course, everyone might have questions for each other. We can have a conversation. So then actually. Brian from the DOE, how about you take it away and start us off?
Thank you. I did send some slides in. Did you want to use them or you just want me to?
Absolutely. Let's pull those slides up.
So I thought I would take a moment. It's a tangential subject to what we're going to discuss here today. But just to acknowledge what's happened in the recent history of Hanford. Recent meaning I've been there 29 years now. And there's a lot of things that have happened since I've been there. So most of you will recognize when I talked through, when I started there, one of the first projects I was on was the infamous burping tank. A lot of people have forgotten what it was like back when I started there and what the controls were in place and the hazards that we faced with the burping tank and the potential for that tank to explode. And so that's been remediated. I worked at PFP, and if you were to go where PFP stood, it's no longer there. It's been completely torn down and removed. It's a very contaminated facility. When I started there, the badging, you went to the 100 area to get your badge. And there's hardly anything left in the 100 area. There's a couple facilities, one under cleanup and one under use of P&L, and then there's a few buildings, the fire station, et cetera, that's still there, but most everything's been there. For years, when I drove by the 100 area, the dome for like a little small reactor dome stood there as a monument. It's all gone, all cleaned up. And so as you go around the site, there's a lot of work that's done, a lot of change that's happened. But probably the most two significant things that I point out this time is we are so close to starting the bit plant. I expect that they'll restart up the heat of the melters here around the 1st of June. So they're going through the startup testing of the replacement components, and it'll be a significant step forward when we introduce rad waste in that facility. Slow, methodical process to start up. So we're still probably almost a year away from introducing rad material into it. They'll go through a very careful testing to make sure all the systems are going to perform as expected and within the permit requirements, but a huge step forward. Recommencing work now on the HLW facility to get that system or that facility online. Big step forward for the site. And then the other thing I'd point out is when I started, there established a set-aside organization called TWRS for tank farms, and that's where I started in TWRS. That became the Office of River Protection, and the two offices have worked together but separately. Intentional that the offices were separated the way they were. In other cases, it was just a natural evolution of the site, but we really did deviate in our processes and the way that we progressed the mission. And as we look forward to today, anticipating the established ORP to sunset, and we would go back to one office. As we anticipate that, we've worked hard to start integrating those two offices back to one office. In doing so, we're identifying areas where we be more efficient and more effective in our mission and the cleanup by being in one office. So I bring that as just background as we start this discussion of where we're going. The department has said that we have at least 50 more years worth of cleanup work. And a significant amount of work that still has to be performed. And in that work, as we talk about future land use, we need to be looking forward to that day, but we can't jump the gun either. We need to have the site cleaned up where it's safe for people to be on the site. So the steps that we'll talk through and the discussions I anticipate today are good discussions, but just recognize. All right, I'll jump through this. It's a fairly short presentation, but just a quick discussion about the Hanford site land use plan. So DOE Office of Environmental Protection, or Environmental Protection, excuse me, Environmental Management, is the largest environmental cleanup program in the world. When they established EM, there were 107 sites across the country that they're responsible for cleaning up. 92 of those cleanups have been completed. We're down to the last remaining 15. Some of those smaller sites are progressing towards the last steps of the process. West Valley, for example, they're tearing down the containment structures and making progress there. And so the list will continue to go down, but there are still significant sites, and EM owns all of Hanford. Whereas if you look at Savannah River, that's a co-owned site. EM has all of it. And Hanford, as I mentioned, is a significant cleanup. As we complete or end our mission, the process by Delia Warder turn over the land to the Office of Legacy Management. They are responsible for the post-closure responsibilities and ensuring future protection of human health and the environment. So there is a process that you can look in the Delia Order that will describe the process for when the cleanup work is finished and what happens to the land processes after that. And I also would mention, I mentioned the Delia Order work too, just to point it out, it is available online. Is Delia Order 430.1C. So you can look up the processes, the steps, and how it occurs. Of those cleanup sites that I mentioned that have been completed, 92, they've been turned over to Legacy Management and are managed by Legacy Management today. Next slide, please. Thanks. For Hanford, we developed a comprehensive land use plan. It's available online. And it was first drafted in 96. In that process, we did a public 90-day public comment session. We had hearings at Richland, Seattle, Mattawa, and Oregon, Portland, and Hood River. We received significant input that caused us to go back and make substantive changes to that plan. So in April of 99, the revised Hanford remedial action environmental impact statement and the comprehensive land management plan went out again for public comment. In that 45-day public comment period, we again had public hearings that were held in Portland, Richland, Mattawa, and Spokane. And the final EIS was published in November 99 in the Federal Register. In that April 99 session, we received over 400 letters and emails and postcards, and we had over 200 pages of transcript of the public meetings. Each and every one of those comments were evaluated and factored into the final product that came out, the comprehensive land plan. In the we call it the club comprehensive land use plan. There's a map that lays out how the anticipated the Hanford site would be. We use this today in the work that we do today. As we do cleanups, we're working to what the future use of the land is. As we do activities, we use this land planning tool. For example, right now I'm replacing a 230 kV line through the site, transmission line, right? And as we evaluated, where do we lay down all that tower steel? Where do we construct new power poles? The land use plan was used to try and follow the tenets of the plan that says we wouldn't disturb new land in those efforts if we could avoid it. And where we did have to disturb the land, we're very judicious to minimize the impact to that land. Just some points on the plan. It's a broad, high-level plan designed to guide land management over extended period of time. So it's supposed to be good for at least 50 years. It was developed with cooperating agencies and consulting tribal governments, including the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, City of Richland, Benton, Franklin, and Grant counties, Nez Perce Tribe, Confederate Tribes, the Umatilla Indian Reservation. I would point out that this is the monument lands that has been set aside. Slides. And is just one other note, the monument lands are about 195,000 acres that have been set aside. And in the rest of the map, there's about 105,000 acres that's been set aside for conservation and preservation purposes. Thus, there's over 300,000 acres in the plan, or about 80% of the land been set aside for conservation and preservation activities. About 62,000 acres, or about 20% of the land, has been designated for industrial research or development in the plan. There are a number of key priorities in there. We only pulled out 4 for this slide, just because I think they're germane to this conversation. But the first is that protect the Columbia River natural cultural resources and water quality. And again, I told you that we use this plan in how we approach and do work. Today, or this year, we anticipate once again treating more than 2 billion gallons of groundwater to ensure that the contamination doesn't flow towards the Columbia. The tests and stuff have showed that we've had a significant impact on the contamination plume, moving it back towards the 200 area. It is, a real step forward in that treatment to protect the river. Wherever possible, we would locate new development, including cleanup and remediation related projects in previously disturbed land. Again, mentioned the steel that goes into those transmission line towers. Well, we picked it up and disturbed so that we didn't disturb new land. It was further away than than where we were working. But again, the commitment was not to disturb the land if possible. Protect and preserve the natural and cultural resources in the site for the enjoyment, education, study, and future generations. So you see the land is set aside for the reach and the activities associated with that. And then honor treaties with American Indian tribes as related to land uses and resource uses. And we continue to consult and work with the tribes on access and cleanup. Next slide, please. Implementing controls. So there are 2 control sets in the plan. These controls are used, as I mentioned, by DOE as we progress the cleanup mission. The first is the area management plans are used as implementing controls. So, sorry, I'm stumbling on my notes here. So we have the RMPs that address specific resources. Some examples of those resources are cultural resource management plan, biological resource management plan, and resources plan. So to give you examples, culture, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. So we have those sacred sites that are on the Hanford site that we'll protect. The biological resources management plan, an example of that is the Tunham buckwheat project, where we had a species of plant that is only grows there that was impacted by wildfire, and non-native species that we've gone back in and replanted. And then an example of the mineral resources is when we have to mine rock, gravel. We are using those existing areas that and not opening up new areas for gravel. The AMPs address specific geological areas. For example, the Hanford Reach National Monument that is set aside. And the Fish and Wildlife Services, currently managed forests and the long-term steward plan. I think it's important to just take a look at an aerial photo of today at Hanford, because it does identify Hanford as a unique location. If you look at around Hanford, you see the significant development in those lands for agriculture and other activities. And what you see in Hanford is the cleanup mission definitely has an impact, but you also see a tremendous amount of land that remains untouched for the last, what's it been since 40, right, the 1940s. That means that land has a special purpose, has some special unique characteristics that you don't find just anywhere here in Washington. I know that was a really brief, just opening remarks. What I really wanted to do is allow the panel time to talk. We'll answer questions, but really leave you with, from the department's perspective, we use that land use plan as our key for moving forward with the cleanup mission to help guide us in our interactions with the public, the tribe, for how we do the cleanup mission. What the future land use means affects what the cleanup standards are as we're working with the regulators, the EPA or Department of Ecology. Though this plan is really to the future cleanup mission and how we will ultimately end up dealing with future uses of the land. I'll turn it back to you.
No, thank you. So that was really a very helpful overview. And thanks for the walkthrough of the difference. That aerial photo was really very striking. What a way to end. Okay, so next, I wonder if we could hear from our tribal partners. So, Randy Contreras, would you mind telling us about the Yakima? Your perspective from that organization?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Lorraine Contreras, Yakima Nation, ERWM. And speaking about, protecting the Yakima Nation resources that are in the Hanford site, you have to understand that, 86 years prior to the Manhattan Project, the Yakima Nation utilized these lands as a wintering place, a gathering place with other tribes. And, it was one of the places where our tribal membership would go to have their prayers and, services to, pay homage to the natural resources that are in that area. So, from the air, the land, the water, the medicines that are there, the Yakima people were always accustomed to, gathering there and, being that the Richland Tri-Cities area is one of the warmest places, it was considered one of the areas where we had our first foods. And if any of you attended the HAB meeting this past month, our tribal youth actually went out and dug roots and shared that during the dinner. And, and that's a practice that we continue so that our youth, always understand and know where they're from. And this area is vital to the continued, practices for the Yakima people. So, I did bring a video, but I wasn't able to have technical difficulties. So I do have it on my screen and I'll just, share with you and talk about it. But back in the 1980s, Occupy Russell Jim was gathering a voice for the indigenous people to, start questioning, what are you doing to our lands there? Because those are our medicines, our resources, our food, and, religious sites. And so he went back, of course, to, DC and started the program, the Environmental Restoration Waste Management Program, 1980s. And I was fortunate, a lot of my staff, you all know, majority of my staff that are technical, cultural, individuals that had the privilege of working with Mr. Jim and, learning from him and hearing the stories and the reasons why he felt that this area needed to be protected for not only the Yakima people or indigenous people, but the community, surrounding the Hanford site. And so he, began to question, that it's not what you see, but what you don't see, that you need to question. And so, for the, I guess a little bit of history of the Yakima people, the Wanapum village has been there since time immemorial as well. And, they are Yakima tribal members and, they're closest to this area. So they were impacted, in their daily living, so to speak, because they live there year round. And, we're able to become part of, the process of, the work that goes on at Hanford and the monitoring that we do to, protect the resources there, because we have burial grounds and we have, the Rattlesnake Mountain, the Moonlight Gate, which are all very respected and sacred to the Yakima people. And as you go on, we have Lalik, which, is being questioned because they want to start doing tours there. And so looking at the future, the Yakima people, since the Manhattan Project began, we have not been able to ourselves go out and just, practice our, the teachings that there are songs and there are prayers that are directly of that area. And there's, as we age, we're losing our elders. And so we don't, we want to keep those songs and those prayers alive so that we can teach them to our youth and that they can continue to go there and, someday, take care of the land and, they say that we have to speak on behalf of the land because it can't speak for itself. And at Hanford, it's hurting and it needs to be healed. And, a lot of people take that to heart when, you can't go out there and just regularly gather your roots and your, we don't have berries so much in the area, but the roots and the other medicines that are accustomed to the area. There are certain plants that are only grown in certain areas within the Hanford Reach in that area there. So, if they become distinct, then we will no longer have knowledge of those plants or use of those plants. And so, we're trying to work to restore the areas there as certain projects are going on at Hanford. You have, contractors that come in and, they're doing their work there as part of the cleanup. But my cultural staff is responsible for making sure that the traditional cultural properties are protected and that if there are remains or artifacts that are found, that they are kept in place. Because you have to respect that, the people that live there and were buried there, we don't want them harmed or touched or, or bothered. And so we have to, make sure that, that we do the most that we can to preserve them, in place there. We have the waterways, the Columbia River, is, natural and free flowing and, and the salmon are, unique to the Yakima people. That's, part of our sustenance and, the amount of fish that, we consume is by far larger than most, because of the way that we practiced. And so, to protect the river is vital and, and I'm appreciative of the land acknowledgement, and the waterways that have, provided the means for, the project there, going on at Hanford and the contamination is always going to be key, because we don't want further harm to the environment or to any person. So, the work that we do is to make sure that cleanup standards are met. And, I've been told that we have to go above and beyond because of the fact that for itself. So we're the voice to make sure that, you know, the cleanup is done. And, you know, we know that a lot of the areas there will never be able to use, you know, because of the contamination. And so the mitigation projects that my staff handle are, you know, done in a manner to, you know, maybe, you know, allow for healing in another area, or to provide, you know, some type of means for our Yakima people to continue to, you know, their practices in their daily lives. And a lot of our community members, you know, we're all on social media. So a lot of our community members I see are still out gathering roots, and, you know, it's that time of year, and we've already had our ceremonies, you know, to honor the fish and the roots that are, you know, coming out. And so, you know, it would be nice to be able to actually go into those areas. We've had individuals that have actually gone out and dug roots there, but they did get sick, you know, and so that's a concern. And, you know, we're not able to actually gather there, and that's hurtful, you know, to our people, because, you know, they lose the ability to freely go there. You know, right now we are able to actually go out into like the Yakima Training Center area to dig roots, and I myself and dug roots, but, you know, there's always a concern for, you know, the safety, but you don't see, you know, what may be there, what contaminants may be there. And so going forward, you know, as far as cleanup, to the Yakima people, the cleanup is never gonna be done in, you know, and so funding is always a huge concern. You know, we're gonna be here from, you know, we were here since time immemorial, and we're always gonna be here going forward. And so, you know, we're always gonna wanna see and support, you know, funding levels to, you know, do as much as we can to clean up and to allow for, you know, continued healing for future generations. And so that's the message that I carry, is that, you know, it's gonna be ongoing, and, you know, it's never gonna go away. So we're always gonna be here, and we're always, you know, hoping to bring, you know, our youth in and our elders. In fact, we do have a field trip scheduled for this Thursday. We're actually bringing some of our elders and our tribal school youth together on a tour of Hanford, in the hopes that, you know, we can recruit, you know, individuals to carry on our work and go forward. And I just attended Stigwig last week in Las Vegas, and, you know, some of the messages there is, you know, with people retiring, you know, they're gonna be leaving the workforce, and we need individuals to come in to fill those roles. I need someone to come in and fill my role. I am honored that, you know, I am the second manager of this program. And I knew coming into this position that I had huge shoes to fill, because Atwai Russell Jim was just exemplary in everything that he did, and the way that he carried the message to protect our people. And, you know, it was, and I actually have to, you know, pay a little bit of honor to my mom. She was in hospice at the time that they were, you know, recruiting and advertising the position. And I was, you know, having that discussion with her, because she grew up with, you know, with Atwai Jim, and, you know, they were like brother and sister. And her message to me is, you know, well, why can't you speak on behalf of your people? Why can't you carry this message forward? And I never had really thought about it, you know, because I just revered the work that he did. And, you know, I worked in our Office of Legal Counsel, and so, you know, we kind of worked in coordination together. And, you know, and I am very honored to carry this role. And I hope that, you know, I can continue to carry the message on behalf of the Yakima Nation, you know, to the best of my ability, and try to recruit individuals to come into, you know, fill my role, because this program is not going to go away. It's going to be here for many, many years, you know, to come. And so I'm hoping that, you know, the work that we're doing is protecting our future generations, and, you know, continued healing of Hanford. And so with that, I guess I will turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. That was very moving. That was very moving to hear, actually. Thank you so much. And it sounds like the vision for sort of future use would actually be doing a lot of the same things that were done historically, but in a future where it's safe to gather those roots and be able to access the land and
know it, We don't
And no
want to lose these.
exactly. And got disrupted during that period. Right. Okay, well then, next, is Hermit Van Killer still on the line? From this first? Well,
If you are, *6 will mute you.
yeah. Well, if we're not hearing from Kermit,
I have a 503 and a 541 number.
well, what we'll do then, maybe we'll, move on, and if Kermit chimes in, we'll circle back, to this first then, if that's okay, we, do that. So, we have John Price on the line from the Washington Ecology Office. So,
Yes, I'm here. I'm hoping you can run my slides for me.
Get there.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm John Price. I'm the Tri-Party Agreement Section Manager for the State of Washington Department of Ecology. Go ahead and hit the next slide. I'll try and get here through this quickly. So when I heard that the board was going to look at Hanford future land use, it occurred to me that there's been a number of land use initiatives over the years. The board may be generally unfamiliar with those, so I thought it would be useful to review those. So, you're not recreating the wheel and can go back and maybe read some of these materials. I've been involved with all of these since 2000. Ken Niles, who's on your board, may remember all of these. I don't, but maybe it'll be a nice review for Ken. Go ahead and hit the next slide. So I'll start out with the Future Site Uses Working Group. That was way back in 1992. So as soon as the Hanford cleanup got started, people started talking about what would be the future land use. It's worth noting the Future Site Uses Working Group was a precursor to the Hanford Advisory Board. They did issue a final report, which you can look at online, and you can see on the right-hand side there, they basically divided the site up into different geographic areas. That's a left-hand column. Identified future use options for each of those areas in the center column, and then had different cleanup scenarios for those different geographic areas as well. Go ahead and go to the next slide if you would. And then right after that, Max Power, who was then with the State of Washington Department of Ecology and was later on the Oregon Hanford Cleanup Board, wrote a report. I'm not sure why Max wrote a separate report since he was involved with the Future Site Uses Working Group, but he did write a separate report. It's not available online as far as I could find. We do have a hard copy here, and I'm guessing there's other hard copies floating around. And basically, you can see the last sentence, the report did not make any recommendations as far as future land use, but was basically trying to identify and discuss key policy considerations. Go ahead and go to the next slide if you will. So I think Mr. Harkins covered the comprehensive land use plan pretty well. Just a couple comments on that. Ecology was not a cooperating agency on the CLUP EIS. We did make some comments on that. Our involvement has been later on, as Ecology has been involved in CERCLA records of decision. Both EPA and Ecology considered the comprehensive land use as one of the things we looked at as far as considering what the cleanup should look like in those records of decision. And go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So the Hanford Advisory Board had a task force back in 2002. This was a big deal. There were multiple meetings that were day long. There was a professional facilitator involved. The HAB ended up writing a final report, which you can see is available online, and then wrote some advice as they do. The agency's response to the HAB's advice on the 200 area is worth looking at, especially there's a last page of that, which was consensus from the Department of Energy, Ecology, and EPA, where we talked about kind of the elements we would consider in making cleanup decisions. There was also an exposures task force report on the 100 area as well. You can, and all of those are available online. So if you want to do some homework, those are available for you to look through. Go ahead and go to the next slide, if you will. So not too long after that, Jesse Roberson, who at the time was the Environmental Management 1 position for the Department of Energy cleanup program, decided that it would be good if all the DOE sites around the country considered their future land use, and actually wrote up reports on that. The Hanford Advisory Board again weighed in and asked for a public process as DOE was doing their own initiative, and there were workshops held at Hanford, and I've got a link there that you can look at as well. That whole idea about risk-based end states was developed because of a DOE directive of 2003 that was later canceled in 2011. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And I believe coming out of that DOE initiative was a report. You can see a image of it there, the Hanford End States Vision from 2005. That document is no longer available in the Hanford Administrative Record. And interestingly, that document number was reused for a different document. So I'm guessing that document was basically withdrawn or otherwise just discarded. But later documents that DOE has produced do reference that vision. Ecology does have a hard copy, but as I said, that document is not available online, so it's not easy to do the homework for that. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide. So the state and tribal government working group, of which the Hanford Effective Tribes and Oregon and Washington are all members, published a report way back in 1999. That was updated in 2017. I was on the committee that updated that report in 2017. And you can see there were representatives from 4 states, 2 tribal governments, and 2 Pueblo governments down in New Mexico that put together that update. And you can see their recommendation, which is number 12 of 23 down there at the bottom. And that report is available online. So there's some more homework reading for you if you want to really dig into it. And then I'll finish up with one more if you go to the next slide. So Columbia River Keeper put out a nice report, which is available online. It includes quotes from a number of different parties. You can see the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission has some subsections referring to statements or positions by the Yakima Nation, the Confederated Tribes, the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and the Nez Perce Tribe. It does quote the report from the last slide, the Closure for the 7th Generation report, and it refers to visions by the U.S. Department of Energy, state of Washington, and Oregon. So I think it's a really nice survey of what a number of different organizations have said about future land use. And I like the last statement, so I'm going to go ahead and read that. I pulled out a quote. It said, the report says there are competing visions for Hanford's future from the perspectives of tribal nations, the federal government, and the states of Oregon and Washington. And again, that report is available online. So that's my summary of some homework reading if you want to dig into it. Thank you. That's it.
Fabulous. That is a super useful summary, actually. Thank you for putting that together. It's like a nice annotated bibliography of like 30 years of thinking on the subject. Very cool. So we'll probably be circling back to some of those reports in our discussion in a little bit, but I wonder if Jeff Schramm from the EPA, if you could tell us a little bit about what the EPA's current thinking is.
Sure. So, in thinking about the theme of today's meeting, and John and I got together and he shared some of the stuff, I spent some time thinking, what can I bring of value to share with the group to understand EPA's perspective? And one of the things that where I landed was understanding the CERCLA process as a compass toward future land use. And so I just want to take a few minutes and talk a little bit about how CERCLA, what role this process plays in leading toward eventual cleanup of the site. And share with you that our guidance speaks to beginning the discussion very early in the process of what the end use of a contaminated site, including Hanford, will be. And you heard John talk about the records of decision, and I think that's an important part of the process. And prior to that, and we're seeing it in a couple of operable units coming up here shortly, is the remedial investigation and feasibility process. And what we're guided in CERCLA to do is to begin that discussion, understanding there are many stakeholders to a site like Hanford, and what kind of discussions need to be had prior to coming to a record of a decision. So we begin asking a few questions, and I brought some guidance to talk briefly about some of them. Some of the questions that are asked is, what's the history of a site? What are the current uses and indications of change? What plans do owner and the purchaser have for the use of the site? What factors favor or limit future use? Which key individuals and groups will determine reuse, and what are their views? How is the community involved in reuse planning for the site? So those are just some of the as to how we approach this challenge, because as we have heard and we'll hear more, there are a lot of different views as to what Hanford should look like at the end of cleanup. And so the CERCLA process, again, through these records of decision, allow us to have that conversation. And in the case of a lot of sites, and Hanford included, we have this CERCLA process for a number of OUs on the site. It's not just a singular site process. We have a number of OUs, and we go through this process through each of these operable units where we investigate and come to records of decision that guide our cleanup. That record of decision process, what's really great about that is that it forces the discussion, it opens up these ideas to other stakeholders and involves the public. So the feasibility, the RIFS is completed, a remedy is selected, that proposed plan goes to public comment, and there's a lot of public involvement leading up to a record of decision, which includes reasonable future land use. And so with every one of these records of decision that we come to on site, we have the discussion about what is the reasonable future land uses of the site. And the club is often cited, and then a description of where in that individual unit, what the future land use is. And so we can be a part of that process together. The guidance calls for that. And then a record of decision is ultimately, hopefully, signed and moved forward, and the remedy is enacted. And that future land use and the remedy are married. And what I mean by that is that after that process has taken place, there's every 5 years, there is what's called the 5-year review process. And the lead agency, in this case, Department of Energy, puts together a protectiveness statement for each of these areas, determining if those remedies that have been chosen are continuing to work. It's not a fire and forget. It is something that is revisited with not only with the regulatory agencies, but with the public itself every 5 years, and determining what is our compass straight? Are we moving forward in the way that we've agreed to, and moving toward this goal? And so every 5 years that opens up, and we have this discussion. It was just 2 years ago when I've only been in our office for 2 years, and about 2 years ago, about a year and a half ago, was our last site 5-year review. So we'll be coming up on that again shortly. Time goes by very, very quickly, and the public and stakeholders will have an opportunity to look at those protective statements, see where the progress that's being made, look at that land use and be part of the process moving forward. So I thought today, rather than speak to some of these end states that the department's talking about and that others will talk about, that I'd take a quick moment and then look forward to discussion later about that compass that CERCLA gives us and that process for being able to revisit that system that allows us to revisit these remedies and make sure that whatever goals we've set for future land use, that we are staying on target with. And so I look forward to that conversation and talking about that process with you all as we look at future land use. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Right, so it sounds like your perspective, it sounds like EPA is more about kind of process and making sure whatever ends up happening happens in a way that fits with this reviewing scheme and the various equities that EPA is responsible for, and is maybe less concerned with what the actual end state is. It's more about how we get there.
Well, I think that we have opinions and are very concerned about end state, but we are regulators and this is a community process, right? And so speaking to this process and making sure that the process that is followed is our wheelhouse, right? So I think it's a good thing for me to understand that there are many stakeholders with many different ideas, and what is my role as an EPA regulator on site overseeing the lead agency. So although we have, ideas but the fact of the matter is that those ideas have been documented in records of decision and agreed upon by, they've been signed off. So our opinion lies within, those areas that have been reported.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Then our last panel, David Replug from TriDeck.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me here. Again, I'm David Replug. I'm sort of wearing two hats. Maybe quickly start by introducing both the organizations that I represent. So the first is Hanford Communities, where I serve as executive director. And Hanford Communities represents the cities of Richland, West Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco, as well as Benton County, Franklin County, and the Port of Benton on Hanford cleanup related issues. Hanford Communities was created a little over 25 years ago to give the local Tri-City area governments a more unified voice on Hanford cleanup policy issues and engagement and information. We also work closely with the Department of Ecology to support public information, trying to get the Tri-City community kind of more engaged and at least informed about what's happening in Hanford. The other hat, and I'll probably be wearing this one for most of the conversation today, is as Vice President for Federal Programs for TriDeck. TriDeck is the Tri-City Development Council. And a little bit of background about TriDeck. The organization was originally created in 1963 at the Tri-Cities Nuclear Industrial Council. It was created by a handful of local business people. And why they created it really was because they recognized that the local economy kind of rose and fell every year based on how much the federal government sent to the Hanford site for plutonium production at the time. And some of these folks happen to have relationships with influential members of Congress or the governor, and decided to kind of pull their efforts together and really advocate really for two things. One, for funding for the ongoing plutonium production mission at Hanford, but also for other industrial activities that would kind of lean toward the expertise that already existed locally in nuclear. So nuclear energy related things, nuclear R&D, that sort of thing. But it wasn't really a traditional economic development organization. And it went from TRICNIC, the Tri-City Nuclear Industrial Council, to TriDeck, Tri-City Development Council, in the mid-1980s, when it merged and began to kind of routine business recruitment, business retention, business expansion kind of work, but then also continue to serve, to have that role of federal advocacy. And the other thing that is, as an organization, TriDeck has always kind of also been our board calls it creative leadership. In a community like the Tri-Cities, where we have 9 local governments, there's not just one kind of central thing that you can go to kind of address community-wide priorities and issues. And so TriDeck is kind of, just by nature of our board, we have a 42-member board of directors, which includes elected officials from all of the local governments, as well as leadership from a lot of the largest employers and some small businesses as well in the Tri-City area. So really get the kind of the three legs of our stool are the business recruitment, retention, and expansion, the creative leadership, and then the federal advocacy. And that's primarily what I worked on, is the federal advocacy, working still very closely with our congressional offices, with others in the community, with DOE, contractor community, some of the regulatory agencies as well, both to advocate for funding for Hanford cleanup, as well as for Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, as well as trying to find a path forward on policies that will help us to achieve success in short and long term with cleanup. The other thing that TRIDEC is the Community Reuse Organization, or CRO, for the Hanford site, which kind of gives like a role in some of the Hanford future land use conversations, as well as ability to receive excess land from the federal government to do economic redevelopment, economic diversification, and development work. But I'm also born and raised Tri-Citian, born and raised in Richland, and I think sometimes we forget now, the community has been growing so much over the last 20 years. It's when I graduated from high school in 1998, when I moved back to the Tri-Cities for good in 2008, probably had almost 100,000 more people, and it's only grown by another 50 plus since then. So now we're a community of about 315,000 people. The economy is far more diversified than it used to be, but for example, my second or third grade class in elementary school, we all wrote letters to President Reagan asking him not to permanently shut down the Henry reactor. And I don't know, I was in second or third grade, so I don't know how it all came to be, but some community leadership must have kind of organized this letter writing campaign from the youth in the community, because that was really the economic driver for the Tri-Cities, and there was huge concern about, if the work at Hanford goes away, what are we going to do as a community? Is it going to be one of those last person leaving the Tri-Cities turn off the light kind of situation? And there was that really very real concern. I mean, and even in the letter, I have a copy of it, and I was referencing workforce retraining programs and things like the average second or third grader doesn't really understand that.
Well,
So we're probably being coached a little bit, but even fast forward almost 10 years past that, when my first girlfriend's in junior high school, she had to leave town because her dad got laid off from Hanford, and there was no work for her in the Tri-Cities. And so it's certainly in the not that distant future, distant past, that we've really had this concern about the long-term stability and growth of the economy. And that's not gone away. I mean, although the community has grown, the businesses have become more diversified between Hanford and P&L, that's still about 25% of the income that comes into the Tri-City area, about 13% of the workforce. And so they're very significant economic drivers for the community. And so Brian shared the comprehensive land use plan. And I think there's, from the Tri-City community perspective, I think there's a lot of interest in, especially in the areas that are kind of designated for preservation and recreation, to work with all of the, especially with the tribes and with the stakeholder community and with the agencies, to really maximize kind of the use of that area for whatever the highest priority is. And we're not really thinking about major economic development, but it's that preservation, understanding the history, and and to the extent where it's possible, certainly really value the prospect of being able to make it available for tribal people to get back out there and do the things that they have done historically. But a lot of our focus more on the economic development side is in that area in the southeast portion of the Hanford site that was in white in the comprehensive land use plan map. And that's the area that's identified for industrial use. And I'm not sure if we're gonna bring that up or not.
I'm gonna try.
And I don't know exactly what the total amount of acreage there is. I'm guessing maybe 10,000-ish acres, something like that, maybe a little bit less. But that's where we really kind of see where there's a real opportunity. Most of that land was not ever contaminated, if not all of it was not ever contaminated. It's fairly close to town, close to Energy Northwest, which operates the only commercial nuclear reactor in the Pacific Northwest. It's pretty close to the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. It's also now part of land that was the first kind of tranche of land that was transferred from DOE to the community through the FY15 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. And so that was first transferred to TRIDEC as the community reuse organization, but then we transferred it to Energy Northwest for about 300 of those acres, and then the other 1,300 acres went to the city of Richland and the Port of Benton. And so if you were to zoom in, actually, I'm not sure if you can see it on this map. Think so, but anyway, that kind of white area in the where the patrol box is, that's kind of the industrial use area that we have in mind. And so exactly, yeah, thank you, Brian.
It's just the Energy Northwest up there, prime area, plant, hammer.
And so about 1,600 of those acres have already been transferred again. And we are hopeful that we'll be able to turn that area into sort of a clean energy industrial hub where we can do all things energy related, whether it's research and development, manufacturing, supply chain, also demonstrations and deployment of kind of first of a kind or new innovative technologies. I think we have a lot of advantages. The fact that we're so close to the river, the fact that we have fairly robust electrical infrastructure. We still need to improve on that some. But we also have the expertise side as well as PNL. And we have a very deep tradition in kind of energy related work in the Tri-City area. And so one of the first hopeful tenants that we'll have in that is what will be the first of its kind green fertilizer or clean fertilizer manufacturer. They're a company that's based out of Norway, but they have decided that this little corner of former Hanford site is a place to open up their first clean fertilizer manufacturing. So they'll take water and clean energy to make hydrogen, to make ammonia, add nitrates, and have nitric fertilizer, which would support most industry in Oregon and Washington in a clean, non-carbon emitting fertilizer that's actually better than the urea-based fertilizer that most of them use now. And a lot of folks don't know it, but fertilizer production globally is about 2% of the global carbon emissions. So if we can kind of deploy some of these new technologies like that, or so many other different opportunities, and cities in Washington State be seen as a global leader in some of this clean energy technology development and deployment, we think that would be a good world to both contribute to kind of the future where we know we can go as a country and as a world to reduce carbon emissions, but also to continue to drive the economy in an area that's not dependent on federal funding on an annual basis. I think there's a video too that I sent over if we can get the technology to work. This video was actually done by our partners at the Port of Benton, and I'll preface it. It kind of lays out the vision, and we've been able to have some very preliminary conversations with some of our tribal partners. Dr. Phil Rigdon from the Yakima Nation have had some conversations with the Umatilla tribe as well, but we need to have more conversations with them. We've had very, very preliminary conversations with DOE, but my point in saying that is that this isn't sort of something that we're actively pursuing right now, but this is just kind of more of the vision for where we'd like to go. But I think it does do a really good job of describing that direction. So if the technology works, we'll go ahead and show the video.
I practiced this last night. I
All
called
right.
someone in a different state. Should work with volume even. So, yeah, it's true. It's true. Give the volume. I'll open up the chat just in case people start getting angry. I can catch it in time. And where's my volume? Yeah, I just upped it all the way. That's at 100. It's on me. It is on Al.
Yeah.
Speakers on Al. Audio devices on Al. Microphone edition. Use your microphone edition.
Yeah, it's through Dell. Click to share.
I'm not sharing this.
Click that. And then, click, see the, up top. Computer down. Top. That one. Then you're good. Yeah. Click on it.
Couldn't share screen.
Click that.
Yeah, so the message is saying it.
You have to disable the L.
Oh, okay. So disable it first.
So audio devices use computer audio.
Oh, no. This is it.
Oh. Right there. Where it says meeting Alfred and change that to computer audio. Okay.
Yeah, right. It's fine.
All right.
It's not.
Didn't check. Let's try this. I don't think speakers will work with folks online. See, the owl was something I couldn't test last night, so. Okay. I think I hear it for someone. Yeah, they might be able to hear it online, but we can't.
Do people ask in the chat if people in the chat can hear?
Mute the L. Mute the L.
I think that's where I can stop for now.
Okay, very cool. That is very neat. Thank you. Then I got word that Kermit is online now. So.
Oh, he was having audio problems.
Great.
We cannot unmute anybody. So Kermit, you're muted now. If you're trying to talk, we can't hear you because you're muted. And we're not able to unmute anybody. You have to unmute yourself. There you go. You're unmuted.
Can you hear me at all? Cause I can just barely hear anything that anybody's saying, so I'm not sure if anybody can hear me. Maybe somebody raise your hand if you can hear my voice. Oh, okay. All right, well, let me let me get dialed in, so I'll have the audio from that side. Just give me just 1 second.
Welcome to the audio conferencing center. Please enter a conference ID followed by pound. meeting organizer, press star now. You're now joining the meeting.
Okay, let's see now.
You are now joining the meeting. This meeting is being recorded and or transcribed. Using music.
Okay, I got a little bit of echoing on my end, but I can hear just the same.
There'll be echoing.
Okay, I took it off speaker and hopefully that'll make a difference.
Yeah, that'll fix it.
Yeah.
We can hear you pretty well.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, if somebody could just kind of give me a lead in, I can get started.
Yeah. So, Kermit, we're ready to hear from you from representing the NESPERS, I believe. And love to hear what you have to say about the vision for post Clean Up Hanford.
Okay, well, I'll just go ahead and I'm still having a little bit of trouble hearing from my end, but I'll just go ahead and go into the remarks that that I bring, and don't really have anything prepared, but you know the description just talked about, you know, the idea of, you know, what the vision for the Hanford site was in the future, and this is something that, you know, the Nez Perce tribe has been working on. You know, we've been involved pretty much since the beginning of the cleanup, or at least the transition. So a little over 30 years. And I guess just really to cut to the chase, I think that our overall vision, you know, for that site, what the Nez Perce Tribal Executive Committee termed their end state vision is for you know, the site to be returned to, you know, pre-Hanford types of conditions. You know, so that, you know, obviously is way out on the horizon. You know, so in the meantime, you know, I think that, you know, the other overall goal, you know, in the meantime is to achieve, you know, some form of co-management, you know, or to, you know, play a strong role in trying to make sure that, you know, the planning and all of the activities, you know, that take place on the site, you know, that they are all intended, you know, to point us towards, you know, that end state vision. And, you know, personally, you know, in my role in this, you know, as a long-term stewardship coordinator, you know, we've got to look at a lot of different issues here, and essentially, you know, just trying to divide trying to divide the planning process up into segments, you know, so we can understand, you know, understand the basic, you know, approach, you know, to the site. You know, so anyway, I guess overall, you know, the utilization as we see it, you know, is going to fall into a few different categories. You know, the first one would be immediate use. And that would probably be considered, you know, within the next several years. And that's likely, you know, to be limited to cultural or traditional utilization conducted under strict conditions, you know, for most of the site, just because of the nature of the site. There may be opportunities for immediate usage in the 400 area, you know, as part of a governmental or commercial operation, or within parts of the Hanford Reach National Monument areas for recreation or exercise of treaty guaranteed rights. But But generally, the immediate use is pretty limited, and I think those opportunities, I think we all have got a pretty good idea about, and most of that's just based on, basic safety, as well as, security for the site and all of that. I think that the next category, beyond immediate use, would be, what I would term near-term use, and that would be, prior to 2078, 2079, within that the cleanup parameters, and that period really represents the primary long-term stewardship planning issue from a practical perspective. And I think the greatest opportunity for near-term use will fall into those areas of the Hanford site which are outside of the active cleanup areas and away from known or potential hazards. Unfortunately, for all of us, only a small percentage of, of a great big site, it really has been used. So, hopefully there will be a lot of opportunities in that near term, for, the tribes and everybody else, to have more access to the site. Let's see, the third category would be, long-term use, and that would be, in my estimation, that period from 2079 to the final completion and cleanup, final completion of the cleanup and restoration activities. So that's somewhere way out on the horizon. Let's see, and although the initial cleanup goals are scheduled for completion by 2079, there is much uncertainty surrounding that goal or those goals. The completion could occur prior to or after 2079, and a lot of that progress is going to be reliant upon the success or failure, of current technology applications, such as the vitrification or the grouting. And also, we've got to consider there is potential for new technologies to be developed, which could speed up the cleanup. But, of course, anticipating new technology, there's a lot of uncertainty. And then finally, the fourth category would just be the end users or the end use post cleanup and remediation time period. And at that point, we would meet the goal, the tribe's overall goal in this. So that phase would occur, at some point in the distant future due to natural dissipation, or when the technology exists to effectively clean up the myriad of current contamination issues on the Hanford site. Once this occurs, the condition of the site should align with the Nez Perce tribe's end state vision for the site, and the area should be available for unrestricted use. But once again, that's way out there on the horizon. But from our perspective, it would be a site that would be just returned to its natural state. Would be used, for the traditional historical and cultural uses and the practice of treaty guaranteed rights by tribal members. And so there's a social aspect to that. There's an economic aspect to that. There's a traditional and a cultural aspect to that. And that's, the overall goal and the way that we would see that used. I think just some footnotes in this, is that, how we would approach, our stewardship efforts. I think historically, it's always been, somewhat a political type of a relationship, and it's been focused primarily on, cultural resources, which is a good thing, the preservation aspect and all of that. But I do also think that as part of our long-term stewardship planning, we just have to identify and take advantage of, more opportunities to be present, at the Hanford site in one way or another. And, that could potentially in the future, include, us having some form of a governmental office there, or regulatory office. It could, hopefully, will entail, us being involved in a business context, with the contractors or directly with the Department of Energy or something like that. But those are, are kind of just some, I guess, just kind of some conceptual ideas, that we have, about how we would try to influence and co-manage and ultimately, play a role in facilitating, the restoration of the site.
All right. Thank you very much. That's really over. I think that fits pretty well. So. This would be a good point for like maybe we can take like a 5-minute break, stretch our legs, get some coffee. I know we've heard from everybody. We can then reconvene in just a couple of minutes and talk about some of our discussion questions and hear what maybe you all have to say based on what you've heard from each other too. So thank you.
All right, I'll mute this during the break.
Yes, 11:30.
11:30.
Sorry, catching up a little bit again. Yeah, you guys want this question. Yeah, all right, this is there. I'm sitting in my ass, yeah, I'm sorry. Right, are we?
We are on mute.
Yeah, we're back on muted, all right, just give it a minute for everyone to get settled back in with coffee and stuff. Our remote participants still with us, John, Kermit, you guys still there?
John's there and, Kermit, yep, he's there as well.
Okay, awesome. So I was wondering if we could actually start, John, with you, with the state of Washington. We really appreciated the overview you gave about the sort of work that's already been done, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how the state sees its role in deciding what happens next. Is that something the state sees that it has a role in, or is it more about, similarly to the EPA's ensuring the regulatory process happens the way it's supposed to and that the state's interests are protected, or do you guys have a more active, what happens?
Yeah, I would say we don't have a more active role. And actually, in our regulations, we refer to respecting, I'm paraphrasing here, respecting the decisions of the local land use planning authority. And in our state cleanup law, we recognize DOE as the land use planning authority for the Hanford site. So, at this point, looking ahead 50 years is about as far ahead as we look. And at this point, we're expecting to, go along with DOE's land use plan for that period of time.
About the the kinds of things that you're wanting to make sure happen, the regulations that you're enforcing or putting into place, you must have some vision of kind of what the ultimate use would be, right? I mean, if it's going to be, used for agriculture, you'd have different ideas than if it's used for recreation or something, presumably, right? So, is that something that plays into Washington's thinking, or?
Yeah, so I can recap what we have put into writing. So for the 100 areas, so the area along the river corridor, we have signed on to the circular records of decision that anticipate unrestricted surface use. So we're thinking that the land surface can be used for any purpose whatsoever, and we've signed on to records of decision that say that. And then in my slide presentation, I referred to the Hanford Advisory Board Advice number 132 and the consensus agency response to that. And point number 1 on the attachment at the back is that the core zone, that is the 200 area, will have an industrial scenario for the foreseeable future. So those are the statements that we've put into writing.
That's what's guiding the thinking. Great, thank you. Does that? I don't know how persnickety to be, provocative to be, but does that work, right? Like if a big chunk in the middle is zoned for industrial use, does that work with what other people need the land to be? I mean, Lorraine, you mentioned historic uses. Presumably, some of that includes that area. Is that compatible with what you guys need?
Well, we definitely have to speak with our elected officials to make a determination on how to proceed or, make requests. I know that we did attend a tour and Mr. Reebok was in attendance with us to look at some of the sites down there and for, that purpose for some considerations. Hearing that it is industrial, if you think back to, before the Manhattan Project, our people would have been living along that area, because of the rareness of the area, which was perfect for, the whole Hanford, setup. So, the waterway and, we'd be practicing our fishing rights and gathering rights there. You know, so definitely we would want that, consideration to be, you know, something that we work with everyone in the development of these areas.
Maybe one thing I might add is, if I understood correctly, I think what John was mostly referring to was the industrial area in the 200 area. And from our perspective, where we're looking at, the industrial area that we're looking at for opportunities is more on that southeast part of the Hanford site, not in that central plateau area. And Brian could probably speak to this better than me, but my sense is that the central plateau 200 area, the industrial use there is going to be consistent with the cleanup mission. So that's where the tank farms are. That's where the majority of the waste treatment will be taking place and that sort of thing. And so there's that kind of long enduring cleanup mission that's going to happen for at least another 50 years. And beyond that, I know there's a lot of questions that will still need to be determined as to, you know, cleanup approach for the tank farms and the tanks and the canyon facilities and all that stuff. But I think that's kind of that was, I believe, the thinking for leaving the central plateau area in industrial use.
What is the ultimate vision for the tank farm itself? Will the tanks, once they're empty, be removed and the whole area backfilled, or what's the vision for that particular area?
I guess it's me. So the current vision is that the tanks will be filled to prevent settling, and that there'll be a land closure cap, and they will be monitored and maintained forever. Okay, too. There you go. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I couldn't say the word, so.
So just to be clear, the actual tank shells are going to remain in place
Yes,
and then filled with concrete or grout?
grout. That's correct. And then impermeable cap that prevents groundwater intrusion and other intrusion actions, animal, et cetera, intrusion.
But the records of decision for those haven't been finalized yet.
So
So
that's correct.
TBD.
Right. So, yeah, thank you for that. And I also should point out, there is a public involvement process as those record of decisions. We go through all of those steps. So I gave you, you know, probably a preferred option, not a final agreed to and permitted solution.
And not only an opportunity for public comment and participation in the process, but, you know, I see my role and EPA's role as a steward of the cleanup and a steward of the process, and that process requires consultation with the tribes. As Lorene was talking about, there are councils and other individuals, decision makers, who need to be part of that process. And the circular process guides that, and it's an important part of that process. So as you know, you ask our opinion of what should be done. It's an interesting question because, you know, I can only say that I trust the process, and my role is to be a steward of the process, because there are many different, as we've heard today, many different individuals, many stakeholders who see that land being used in different ways. And the process allows for their voice, both the public and to honor the government to government relationships through consultation. And it's important that, you know, we as the EPA provide assurance that those processes are met and those voices are heard.
So can I ask a question, Jeff, to that point, on a 5-year review cycle on a record decision? What do you do, what does EPA do if you find that I guess DOE in this case, is not progressing towards your records of decision, towards your goals? What did you do 2 years ago? What would you do in 3 years, every 5 years? How do you course correct? What do you do if things are going, in your opinion, sideways or perhaps not on track?
So I can't speak to that with a lot of authority because I'm new to my position, but I'll use an example of we talked about Kermit talked about new technologies. Let's talk for a minute about new contaminants, PFAS, for instance. The 5-year review process is what we used as an agency to identify that, yes, this is an issue and it needs to be addressed. And DOE is working within their system, not to speak for you, Brian, to begin to look at that process on our site. So I guess the answer I can give you, Max, is that if we notice that there is an issue, that we begin discussions and talk about, why is there an issue? Why is the remedy not being met? We can, I was trying to think, and maybe some of you can help me a little bit from the ZP1 process. I don't know if the issue with the chromium bloom was found in the 5-year, but it ultimately ended up in an optimization study that depending on data, could lead to a ROD amendment. So, when you go through the 5-year process and that there is some discrepancy or there is a delta between where you're going and where you wanted to go, then you begin those discussions and figure out what is the plan moving forward to meet those remedial goals that are outlined in the ROD. Those are important, and they need to be met. And so, it's a complicated project, and things do go off track sometimes, and even with everyone's best intent. And so it's about how we get back on track and how do we move forward. And a 5-year review process allows us to document that, allows the public to see that, it's a transparency in that process, and allows there to be participation in moving forward. Does that answer your question somewhat?
And the carbon tetrachloride plume is a good example of that, where the record of decision said there was going to be monitored natural attenuation of the plume, and it would take, 40, 60 years to go away. And during the monitoring, there was some modeling done. PNNL took some more additional field samples, and the microbes that eat the carbon tetrachloride weren't necessarily in favorable conditions. And they said, no, it's actually going to take 600 years to degrade. So they're going back and doing an optimization study and sort of updating the record of decision. So it's an iterative process. It's not just set it and forget it.
Thank you, Tom.
So this is a bit murky. I'm trying to understand some of the history of this site. It's my understanding that Hanford was going to be returned to the tribes in the condition in which it was borrowed. So, I don't know if that's technically part of a treaty, but I've read it. I've understood this for a long time, that the United States government is going to return the Hanford site to the tribes in the condition in which it was taken from them, which we know is not, going to be easy if possible. So there's that. And then some of the Hanford site has already been sold to businesses like Permaflex Northwest. So it's already being siphoned off. And question is, do the tribes have first right of refusal? Or is it offered to them first? I mean, there's just a lot of blurry pieces here for me in terms of how this is going down with the original stewards of this land.
Sounds like a fabulous question. Does anybody have any?
Let's jump in. So I would refer you to the club, and I would refer you to the descriptions in there of the processes that are used for land conveyance. And I would also refer you to the map that shows ownership of the land when the department took it over. You'd be surprised at the ownership. There are recognized treaty rights, and we honor those treaty rights. That's not the issue. There's also recognized ownership of those lands when the department took it from the people that were living on the land at the time. The future of how we work through that is pretty complex. It's not a straightforward description, but the process is well described. It involves consultation. It involves looking at for national historic significance, cultural impacts. There's a fairly complex process that we will go through.
I wish I knew more about that complex process.
So do I, to be honest with you. And I have smart people that work for me that can do this, but it is, there's a lot to the process, so.
So was the B reactors turnover to the National Park Service part of that process?
Big guy know the answer to that. Somebody else might know, but that was done through a congressional act and I mean, there are reviews, but beyond that, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I might be able to speak to that a little bit. So, yeah, when the Manhattan Project National Historical Park was created, there's two agencies ultimately involved, the Department of Energy and the Department of the Interior, under which the National Park Service operates. And so, those two agencies came together and developed essentially a partnership agreement, where DOE retains responsibility for access and safekeeping of the facilities that are part of the park, not only at Hanford, but also at Oak Ridge and at Los Alamos. And then the National Park Service is responsible for the interpretation and kind of and Hanford is kind of unique. The other two sites is really far more limited public access. We do have the public tours of Hanford and some of the historic pre-Manhattan Project town sites, but I think the Hanford site is still in charge of actually getting people out to the site, out to the B reactor, and the National Park Service kind of does the interpretation once they get out there and that sort of thing. And so, and that's something I neglected to mention earlier, but from the community's perspective, we were really excited about the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. Obviously, it's a very complicated story, and there's some things that I think that anybody who goes out there and tours the B reactor or learns about the Manhattan Project overall kind of leaves you a little bit conflicted, the whole story, but it's a story that's worth telling. And so in the future, we would like to see as, the active footprint of cleanup kind of continues to shrink and maybe some of the fences where we can kind of get moved in closer and closer to the central plateau. We'd like to eventually, allow the national park to grow to what we think could be its potential. This is probably, a decade or more into the future, but wouldn't it be great if we could eventually have people drive their vehicles straight out to the B reactor rather than having to get on a bus down in Richmond and drive all the way out there and then drive back? Maybe have a visitor center and that sort of thing as well, just to kind of tell the story. And I think there's also a really good opportunity. I think that they have docents who do the tours and stuff. I think they've tried at some level in the National Park Service to incorporate some of the pre-Western settlement, some of the tribal history of the area, but I think there's a lot more of that story that we could tell, either directly as part of the National Historical Park or at least in conjunction with that. And so I think there's an opportunity there as well. So, and I should also add that we have what's called the Tri-City National Park Committee, the mayors of all four of the Tri-Cities, along with folks from the counties, and Visit Tri-Cities, TriDec, and other organizations are part of that. And we just had a meeting a couple days ago, so it's a very active kind of element of what we see as that way in the future to both. There's a small economic development angle in that it'll bring hopefully tourism and stuff like that, but really just to tell the story. Is it, again, I think it is the story that's worth telling.
How compatible is that sort of development with historical and traditional uses of the site? Is there, I mean, it sounds like building a visitor center, that sounds like that would be very different from restoring to the pre-Manhattan Project state entirely. But is that an amount of development that shared use that is consistent with the needs of historical users, or is that incompatible?
But I think like one of the areas that and again, this is not next year, this is probably 10 or more years from now, but one of the areas that we've kind of played around with and kind of brainstorming where you could potentially locate a future visitor center to be at what's called the Brueggemann Warehouse, which was a ranch warehouse. And there was a Western settlement literally on that, on that land. So it wouldn't necessarily be disturbing, undisturbed ground. It's land that had already been farmed and settled at one point in the, pre-Manhattan, but post-settlement. But I think that the footprint of the national park would be pretty small. I don't think there's any plans to do significant new development. It's more, I mean, at most, maybe a visitor center of some sort, but more just access for the public to see the B reactor, eventually maybe and they can see the now White Bluffs Bank, the original Hanford High School, and maybe in the future Howard Pump House and some of those other things as well. But we're not talking about building a lot of new stuff. It's more just access to tell that story.
Lauren, what's your thought? Yes, please.
Thank you. So, speaking about these areas, I've actually gone out on the tour and just, stood in awe of, the beauty of the area, and imagining, what our people would have been able to do there had, there not been the contamination, destruction of, the whole essence of that area. But, in going forward, we're all living in a modern society, and the Yakima people have always continued to acclimate to, I guess, catch up, in presence there. And so, I think it's a good idea that we do have, set the telling of the history, and that's been difficult because of the fact that, a lot of our elders, we do have some film that, we have taken in the past, and, those individuals are gone. And we did share that one of the videos, with the Hanford Advisory Committee, but it's critical, to continue to, try to access the stories from our people that live there. And, my family has history of, following the gathering of the foods and, even now, it was mentioned, that we do have Yakima Nation farms, that the Yakima Nation is purchased, and, so continuing to meet the needs of our people. And I'm very fortunate that, in my career experience, I was actually the tribal archivist at one time, and going back and reading through all the historical documents and how the tribe has been developed, and, the basically survival that we've, implemented, methods to, try to protect and preserve the cultural significance of, our people, and all the, the 14 bands that consist of the Yakima Nation. And, so our territory actually goes up to Canada, all the way down to California. And, and in the Hanford area, it was, there were very few people that would, tell those stories. And I remember our elders when I was younger, telling us, or even my grandfather, would tell us about, this area down here, because he, used to, travel back and forth. And my dad's side of the family would go the opposite way. My grandfather's actually married in Muckleshoot. So, we have those community relationships, like our community relationships with, the Umatilla and with the Nez Perce, and, and we're all, one people, and joining to, protect and preserve this area. So, hearing the history, and, we can't actually share all of the songs or the prayers, but that's for certain things. And, and I'm just trying to, make my presence, as far as the work that I'm doing, always in the best interests of our people. And so I think, if you go to those areas and just stand there and just look at it and envision what it used to be, that's what I wish for. And, I heard the lady ask the question, well, how are the tribes intermingled, our treaty rights there? If you consider, like, remember those cassette tapes that you used to put in in your car, and it would get all mangled? Well, that's our treaty. Or that's how I feel. This is my personal, opinion about it, is, it's all mangled and, twisted. And so there's a lot of processes that, the tribal community needs to work through to, gain the best, I guess the best opportunities, or the best common presence for that area to continue to be monitored. And, we do have, like, through the records of decision, we've actually been able, the Yakima Nation has actually been able to go back and, revise, because in the past, we were not consulted with. And there's a lot of, you can go back through the history of Hanford, and, and the tribes weren't involved, we weren't asked to come to the table, and it was, and that's the exact reason why Ottawa Russell Jim decided, well, we need to start questioning, because these were our areas that we used to go to, and we need to protect them, and, and ask those questions. And, I remember as a youth, I remember him receiving, like a lot of our members were, if they weren't, like the ones that normally traveled here, because you had people going to the river, you had people going to the west side, like my dad's side of the family, and then you had my mom's and my grandfather's side of the family that would come along the Columbia, and, so we traveled everywhere, and, we didn't recognize boundaries, because of the fact that, these were certain places that were special to our people, and, and when all the communities came together, you shared, and so, in my personal history, I have ties to, Nez Perce. I have relatives in Pendleton, Umatilla. And, I have a family in Colville and Suquamish, and, so it goes on and on, we're intermingled that way too, but here, the presence of the Yakama Nation and our 14, bands that consist of the Yakama Nation, that's what we need to protect, and the Columbia River is key, to that source, and, and I've always shared, in other meetings that I've attended, that my concern is, the protection of our salmon and, the use of it, and, you've seen the numbers rise in cancer, among our people, because that's one of our staples, and, contamination in the river is always going to be a big concern, first and foremost, and then the land, and, all the animals, and, they say that there's a spirit in everything, and, and I personally teach my grandchildren, like even with a spider, you don't kill it, you just move it, or you get out of its way, because it's part, it's part of our, entire ecosystem, and, paying respect to that. And so that's what our people ask for, is a continued respect of the land. It's been, harmed, and so we need to do our best to, heal it. And so, going forward, I know there's always, the need for, we all need money, we all need a paycheck, and we all need to, make our lives, affordable for everybody, and, a lot of, and it's not I guess it's common to know that, most tribal communities live in, grave poverty, and, they don't have access to a lot of the services, and, and it's, I remember growing up, people asking, well, don't you get, paid, for, like a per capita. Well, that was based on resources, in our timber, we don't clear cut, so we tend to, want to preserve, our, as much as of our earth as possible. So, that's the perception that I bring is, we just need to continue to focus on healing, and I appreciate everybody in this room, because you would not be here if you didn't care about that, and making sure that our communities are safe, and that we're able to go forward in a good way, to make a living, and, and to, do the best that we can to preserve Hanford and heal it. And so, where the Yakama Nation continues to grow and learn, about processes and opportunities. We may be, perceived as coming slow to the table, because we're not part of the TriDet. And that's, the reasoning and the beliefs and practices of, my elders, and I have to respect that, and so, and it has kind of crippled us, the work that we do, because we're not fully engaged. And, within our cooperative agreement, we're supposed to be. And so, our staff continues day by day to, look at all the technical work going on, as well as the cultural side of things, to make sure that, all of our resources continue to be protected, and, as we grow, and other, we work closely with EPA ecology in review of, a lot of the decisions that come forth, and, then I take that back to our leadership to make sure that, they understand, what's happening. And so, there's a lot of wheels spinning, throughout this whole process, and And I do appreciate my staff because they're on top of it, you know, they're trying to work through all of the details, you know, and what it takes is the continued, you know, I guess, communication is key, you know, with all of our work groups and, you know, going forward, you know, that we're all on the same page and that we, you know, we may not always agree on everything, but, you know, because you have to meet your certain goals and, you know, the plan. Well, the accommodation is always, I always feel like we're holding on to the kite tail, you know, following because we need to make sure that, you know, we're involved and that we're part of the process. And so, you know, to be part of the process so that, you know, our future generations will be able to, you know, understand and recognize the history of the area. That maybe have been too long, but.
No, very good.
Sir, I have that to remember trying to fix a few cassettes that got eaten by cassette players. Although unfortunate, it's a good analogy for that. And if I may just take a quick moment, say, you talk about compatibility and incompatibility of these different ideas for the site, and I feel that the most important thing is that, as Laureen just gave an example to, is that there's a voice at the table, because we can't assume other people, you know, we can't assume what's compatible or what's incompatible to another, you know, another person or another entity or another government or, you know, and so having the voice at the table, a continued voice at the table, is incredibly important. And I think that's kind of where we lie at the EPA, is assuring that we follow those processes and that DOE is following their obligation within CERCLA to do that as well. And that those voices are heard, and that when you have competing ideals of what that land's going to look like, that those voices can work together to come to a solution. So I appreciate what you're saying.
So when you look at the satellite images of Hanford, the outside the northern perimeter of the site, there's a lot of agriculture. Does anyone envision any agriculture at Hanford in the future?
The land use plan doesn't define what industrial means to those areas that are identified as industrial. It doesn't go on beyond that. So I just don't know how to answer about it. And there are areas that have been identified as potential industrial areas. Some of those areas might potentially be used for agriculture. Some of those areas will be unable to support agriculture because of the contaminants that will remain past cleanup.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, and again, I think we're talking only about the industrial area. I don't think there'd be any irrigated agriculture or anything on the preservation or conservation lands. And I think from our perspective, in addition to what Brian mentioned about potential contaminants in the soil and the groundwater, it might make it not very palatable to do any sort of irrigated agriculture. I think there's probably just higher and better uses for the fairly comparatively limited industrial area. We might be able to see, you know, as part of if we achieve this vision of being this place where energy-related R&D happens, one of the areas that people look at is biofuels, alternative fuels, and that sort of thing. And is there a way to, are there different types of crops that you can practice? Will it grow out here in an arid environment without irrigation? And then if so, then how could you turn that switchgrass, wherever it might be, into biofuel? You know, so perhaps very limited agriculture, but at least in terms of the community's perspective, any of the conversations that we've been having, I don't think there's any significant thought about agriculture out there.
I would remind you the comment I made when I did my opening remarks is that 80% of Hanford in our land planning documents is set aside for conservation, preservation. That's not farming. So that's over 300,000 acres of land. It's easy to see the monument area, right? That's easily identified on the map. The Rattlesnake and the North Slope areas are easily identified, but it goes well beyond that on the site of the planned use of the site.
So. And I think there's actually a question back here.
It's me.
Oh, yes.
Shelley,
Oh, of
someone
course.
else.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for these presentations. I'm really enjoying this and appreciating being able to think about this. Jeff, something really resonated with me, and that was, making sure, people need to be at the table. And then the question then becomes, where is that table? And how do people access it specifically? I mean, I'm thinking about the tribes, of course, but other organizations that may want to be there to be able to participate and say, no, this isn't going to be redeveloped in an industrial fashion. And so I think that's something that needs to be thought about more, and that's transparency in the processes of making decisions at the site. And in tandem with that, it was, the city of Richland did a study on the 300 area when the 300 area was being cleaned up and buildings were coming down, to look at reindustrialization there in the private community. And they contracted a study, and I can't remember the year because I'm terrible with timing, but they had no takers for it. So what does that mean then, and how does that inform reuse at the site when land becomes supposedly cleared and clean for reuse and we can't find takers for it?
I'm not aware of the study, Shelley, so can't really address that. I do believe there are activities that will grow out there. P&L has been moving and growing their campus into those areas. So those lands have potential use. It's not the department's job, if you will, to solicit those uses, but with the support when there is a request for those uses. And so, but the actual report, I can't really answer your question.
And to address the first part of your question, Shelley, is what does that table look like? From my perspective, it is, it's multiple tables, right? Laureen and her staff and our team, the CERCLA team for EPA, meet on a monthly basis. The Umatilla and the NESPERS, we meet quarterly. Those intervals are dictated by the tribes. And I think what that means is that this idea, there is no central table, right? There are individuals and organizations that are willing to open themselves up to talk about the difficult aspects of what we do, the challenging things of what we do, and being willing, the Department of Energy being willing to do that with different entities on a technical level and at other levels as well. Kind of build to that kind of that idea of a singular table, but it's not one table, right? It's the have and the influence that the public has on the decision making and the advice that the public give on that. It's the technical folks that get together and talk about where we're at in the process and what does that mean and for future land use, or what, how are we going to clean this? It's those discussions. It's discussions at an executive level on what kind of culture are we going to have? Is it going to be are we going to have a transparent culture? And so I think there's many aspects to that, and it takes an effort from all sides. I was interested to hear Lorraine talk about feeling like her group is holding onto the tail of a kite. Yeah. Sometimes I feel that way too, right? Like, it's complicated and stuff's moving so fast, and sometimes, and rightfully so, folks have been left out of that process. There's very clear history that there's been, that has happened. And so we have to work diligently in making sure that we're constantly connected, that we're building personal relationships with people, and that we're taking on the tough questions and challenges and working together. But I don't think it's it's not a simple answer, but I think it comes down to that. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I see the table looking, right? It's multifaceted.
It is, and I guess my question is, when it's stratified such, then, it's difficult to come together with one voice. And does that matter? Because that's what I'm thinking, does that matter?
I think voices matter. I think that having a voice matters. I think it's tough. There's a lot of siloing, right? You know, that's just human nature too.
Thank you.
And had a question. And then, okay.
David, on the, as the energy park development occurs, if 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you say, gee, where'd that tritium come from? Or where did that, whatever come from? Does DOE retain the liability from this point forward, or is there a point of cutoff, or what happens?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know for the 1,641 acres that were transferred, there were some deed restrictions that kind of limited, at least set parameters for what could or couldn't be done. And I think there's some level of restrictions on the amount of water that can be put on the ground and that kind of thing, just in case there were some contaminants in the soil. But I think that there's been enough both environmental assessments as well as historical records where you know where there's very high likelihood that there wouldn't be any sort of contaminants. And I think most of the area that we're looking at is within there. But I don't know that I have a very clear answer to that question. And I don't know, Brian, if you would know, or if that would have to be something that would have to be addressed, you know, because if we were to, in the future, develop this land, it would first probably have to be transferred out of federal ownership to whoever would be the recipient. And so maybe that'd be a parameter that would be included in that land transfer process.
And I would agree, you could get to a certain level of certainty, but with Hanford, you never know.
That would be, wouldn't that come out in the circular 5-year review process, though? If you find a new contaminant, then going back and sleuthing where it came from, would be part of that reevaluation, right?
That is correct.
But if land ownership is transferred,
I'm not, we're getting into areas that probably is, lawyers need to get involved. But I'm gonna express my opinion. My opinion is it's just because we signed over the deed and we've done our best to identify things like historical and cultural, and those kind of things, and including contaminants, that a future new discovery will impact and come back to the polluter or the, having to address the national historic and the cultural and stuff like that. So there are laws and regulations. I'm just not a lawyer that can draw a nice fine line. I'm not sure a lawyer could, right? It's pretty murky, but I think I can say that there are avenues back. We don't know everything about everything, and I'll just take a one that's cultural. We do our best to consult with the tribes, government consultation, to understand the history, and they do a great job supporting us. But sometimes we're all surprised by what's found, and when we find something that is a cultural, then we have to address that. It's a new discovery, if you will.
Sounds like that's a parameter that would then affect anybody who wanted to do any kind of commercial or industrial development. That would need to be part of their planning, that there's this wild card that you might break ground and find God only knows what, and there'd be a higher risk of that, this site, than maybe some other random industrial site that you might be working on.
So I would envision there are controls. We say it that way. An industrial area doesn't mean that someone's going to mine the soil in tank farms in the future, right? So an industrial might be compatible for somewhere that is doing only surface work. Or a energy development, say a solar farm or something like that, it's not disturbing the soil. But, you know, it depends on the area. I think it's a very good site, had a lot of work going on it. So it all depends on exactly what was there and what we can prove and disprove. And sometimes we can't prove everything to satisfaction. And so with that then comes restrictions. So you can't break you can't drill a well in this area. That, we know there's contamination in the groundwater in this area. It's being treated, but it's still there and will be there for decades, hundreds of years to come, and still require that groundwater treatment that we're doing today to continue to remove those contaminants. So you can't drill a well here if you're restricted, depending again on where you're at.
The term of art is institutional controls, right? And I'm not a lawyer either, but little I understand about it is that I believe they follow a deed. I could be mistaken on that, but I think that there's as Tom mentioned, there's a 5-year review process, so you're constantly revisiting that and making sure that the remedy options are working. But again, yeah, as Brian said, I'm not a lawyer to know how that would come back, but I can't imagine that some sort of new owner to the property would be responsible for an unfound tritium plume that suddenly shows up. I mean, that wouldn't make sense, a lot of things make sense there. There are uncertainties outside for sure.
So for the room, you'll recognize this when I say the name Love Canal. So think of my little bit of understanding. Love Canal was a industrial contamination disposal, very poorly done, and a housing development. And who was responsible for that, the financially clean up, et cetera, the company, not the landowners and stuff like that. Now it took a lot of court cases and established a lot of new laws came out of Love Canal. And those are, factors or how, have crafted where we are today is what occurred with Love Canal.
You got a question?
Yes, it's for the Department of Energy, on tank closures to sea farm. My understanding is that right now it's gone through the NRC, the review has gone through the NRC, whether or not there's a waste incidental reprocessing, and now is now in a group, I forget the initials, but a group of, like an ad hoc group within the DOE to make a determination as to whether or not the waste left in the tanks is now waste incidental reprocessing. And if so, could you do you know much about that ad hoc group? Is there transparency? Will their meetings be recorded and shared?
You're way beyond my knowledge, so I apologize.
Okay.
I help, pump the stuff out of Sea Farm, but haven't been involved in the environmental process. It's not my area. So I will be glad to give you a name that could get you information.
I'd like to know where that's at.
So, yeah, because I don't know the status, so.
Okay, that's fine.
Dan,
Yes.
if you'll send me your question, I'll see what I can do to get you an answer.
Okay.
Here's
Gary, okay.
I got a question, maybe a comment, question. The institutional controls concept, particularly thinking about the inner area, Central Plateau, it'll be a restricted area in perpetuity. There's a lot of assumptions that the American government will be able to manage and maintain for hundreds of years, longer than this country has ever existed, right? That there will be people doing these jobs and managing that area for that time period. We think about in the state of Oregon, our program also handles in-state disposal of radioactive waste from our state regulations and restrictions. And we do modeling based on assumptions for the intruder scenario, where you think about a person who might build a house and drill a well into an area and drink that water and live on that site. A way to keep that out is with controls, restrictions, but you have to have somebody, a government entity, to enforce that, right? So just maybe some assumptions when we're thinking about this. The legacy and the controls will be in place much longer than this country has existed, certainly longer than the states of Oregon and Washington have existed as states. Anyway, that's maybe just more of a comment. The other question, perhaps, when I was curious, is to one of your very first points, Brian, you mentioned the number of environmental management sites across the country has been worked down from 190 something, wasn't it, down to 15 in the 15 biggest last ones, right? That are on the site. But that's a lot of records of records of decision, but also knowledge and institutional knowledge, to use that phrase, experience that has been gained in closing sites and then I presume doing something else different with those sites. And I'm curious as to, I mean, the question here is what models does DOE or EPA look to around the country to think about how things have been done and maybe lessons learned? You know, I think about the most famous example is the Rocky Flats site in Colorado, where it's been cleaned up to a level where I think it's kind of a natural park now, a major area park. And that's a level of land use that is that's different. You don't have an industrial site, you don't have housing developments, you have a natural area where people might come and build for a limited period of time. And so your assumptions of risk are different based on that land use scenario there. So anyway, I don't know if there's a sort of question buried in there as to what degree might you look to other models across the country for lessons and for what might come at the site.
I think Jeff's probably better talking about the circular process. So, you know, for Hanford, we're governed under circle and recra, depending on where you're at in the site. So Tank Farms is under recra, and it's not quite as clean, but you know, the rest of the site is in the circular. The circular process, as I understand it, and I'll let Jeff describe it better, is really that avenue that models what is the future use, what is the potentials for somebody drilling a well and hitting the contamination, et cetera. So maybe, and I don't need to put you on the spot, but
No.
Also,
You're all right.
I think John might want to weigh in on the record side. too.
yeah, go ahead.
John, is there something you'd like to say before I?
Yes, so I'm going to reference back to the Hanford Advisory Board Advice number 132 again, and the agency's response again. So we wrestled with these questions back in the early 2000s. And at the time, the framework we set up is we assumed that cleanup would take 50 years and there would be active institutional controls for 100 years. And then we asked for an intruder scenario to be analyzed after that 150-year period. And so the concept really is, if you allow 100 years of active institutional controls after 50 years of cleanup, then a lot of radioactive decay takes place during that time. So, you know, your risk from radiation is going to go down during that time. And if you analyze an intruder scenario after that 150-year period, it may influence your cleanup decision. So if you see things might still be unsafe after 150 years, you might do a little more cleanup. So that's the thinking behind that response. I'm done. Thanks.
Thank you, John. From a circular standpoint, I have to say that, you know, end use is I'm not super familiar with how the EPA has approached federal facility end use. These are long-term projects. What I will say, you know, when you listen to John talking about 50 years and 100 years, is that again, every 5 years, you know, in that process, you've got the public, the lead agency, and folks looking at that, tribes looking at where things are going and minding that fog line, because sometimes it is a little bit murky in the future. But we've identified, you know, cleanup levels. We've identified what the future in rods, what the future the reasonable future land use is for that particular area, and you mind that fog line. I can't speak with from experience for some of those other sites, Max, but I'll tell you, there's, you know, benchmarking is invaluable, and we don't want to be recreating the wheel every time we go to a cleanup site. And the beauty of that I can speak to, the beauty of our organization and DOE's is the same way, is that we've got a lot of resources and a lot of folks that have put a lot of time, effort, and energy into doing that benchmarking. And so we lean on them within our organization to see that. But I unfortunately, I can't speak to a lot of those sites and what they've done. And but I'll take the opportunity again to speak to the 5-year review process, the circular process of identifying, bringing people to the table. You know, when there's challenges, bringing those same stakeholders to the table and addressing those issues every 5 years. It's funny because I remember as an intern with this office in 2013, and I can't remember who it was or what tribe it came from, but the argument was made that we would have these institutional controls in place in perpetuity, and someone had stood up and said, how can you say that? You know, the United States is just just over 200 and a half years old. You know, how can you with authority say that you're gonna be able to do that? And the reality is that we don't know the future. And all we can do is do the best we can, right now, trust in the process that we have, the circle process that we have, continue to assess and change and make sure all voices are at the table as we work toward this end goal. But I can say that the end result of Hanford is gonna be very, very different than any of those other sites, right? You know, and every one of them probably say the same thing. We're our own special little snowflake, right? And you know, it's complicated, but you know.
So Max, I would say that the site has done massive amount of modeling to try and address exactly that. And for years and years of modeling, paired with on-site testing. So there are on-site active ongoing tests to see how contaminants break down, how they move, not just radioactive contaminants, but hazardous materials. And that are multi-year studies that PNL is paying for. So we put in caissons and we put in water flows through them to simulate current historical water rainfall and future, you know, anticipate, and to see how those contaminants might move and how they also might be brought back to the surface, right, in a, you know, future scenarios. And those modeling will continue today, but that is being used to inform the decisions that go forward. Those processes will be presented in the public forums as there's logs, environmental impact statements and stuff are done. Those will be presented in the data. I'm sorry, Matt.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to quickly say this, is that, you know, the tsunami in Japan in 2011, you know, when after all was said and done, they found a place where the ancestors had actually chiseled into the cliff, don't build here, or don't build this high. I'm not, the specifics kind of elude me, but that I'm sure of, that there was a message from the ancestors. And I think it's in Australia, there's a huge tract of land that contains uranium. They know, ancestors told them, don't unearth this, it's bad, it's toxic. So these stories, we were talking earlier about the importance of stories. This is a big piece of it. If we can listen to the ancestors, if we can listen to the stories, if we can tell the stories, that has to, you know, be part of the institutional control process. And I don't think we're very good at that, obviously. This is a thought.
I think looking at the clock, we probably need to wrap it up at that. But I look forward to, we have lunch in the back. We can continue discussing all of this amongst ourselves during the lunch period. Thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you, Kermit and John, for joining remotely and bearing with us with the AV challenges that our staff here heroically worked through. So I just want to, let's give the panelists and everybody a round of applause. For time and expertise, and we'll close the session with that.
So we will reconvene at 1 o'clock for Tom Cecil's.
Really exciting. Draft agenda.
So the next item on the agenda is Mr. Thompson. And he's going to give us the Oregon experience. Is that
Something like that. I wanted to sort of take a step to the details of what's going to happen at Hanford, look at what might happen and how Oregon might have a role in what's gonna happen. So as soon as the slides get up, we'll get started, but not rushing anybody. A lot of what I'm gonna be talking about has already been sort of broached, so hopefully I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. Speaking of different angles, I hope no one minds if I don't go up there and talk, if I can sit here. I'm closer to the owl anyway, for those of the folks online have to look at me on their computer screens. So, yeah, so wanted to talk about what happens when active cleanup is done. And we know that active cleanup is not cleanup in the entire story of cleanup. There's going to be cleanup that goes on naturally after the last person has left the site doing remediation work. So we'll go to the next slide. So I wanted to first say, what do we know and what don't we know? We don't know what. There's a lot of cleanup decisions that haven't been made yet. There's a lot of records of decision that haven't been signed yet. And without those records of decision, we don't know what the cleanup standards are. We don't know how long the institutional controls or what institutional controls are going to be there. We do know that it's going to be one of the largest monitoring scopes in history once this site transfers to long-term stewardship. We obviously don't know when that's going to happen, other than it will happen eventually. We don't know that haven't been done yet, no monitoring plans. We don't know how the monitoring is going to happen. Has the monitoring technology that's going to be deployed in the 2100s been invented yet? Is it going to be more cost effective to put a geosynchronous satellite over the site rather than having a force of 5,000 people going out to sample wells every month? What kind of telemetry is going to be there? And we don't know who's going to do it. The Office of Legacy Management is only 20 years old. B reactor is only 80 years old. The country is about 250 years old, whether you look at the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. You know, looking at bureaucracy itself has only been around since, what, 3000 BC. The contaminants that we're talking about are going to be here longer than there's been bureaucracy. 100 years is a really long place in bureaucracy space, let alone 10,000. So let's go to the next slide and talk about what we do know. We know that the slides came out really weird on that screen. They look different than mine. But we know that the site is going to contain waste. The river might move around, but Hanford's still going to be there. So we have to make sure that whatever decisions we make are taking into account the fact that rivers move and meander, you know, on the orders of centimeters or millimeters per year, cutting into and depositing, but it's going to happen over that time. 12,000 years ago is when the Missoula floods happened. So that waste is still going to be there if 12,000 years in the future. And we know why it's happening, and we know it's happening because the federal government has a moral and legal requirement to do it. That we have to make sure that the cleanup is protective of human health and the environment. So next slide. So that's no, okay.
I must have taken a version from Teams.
Yeah, there's some sections of there that go on there. So the question is, how do we estimate what long-term stewardship will look like when we don't know anything but why and where? And so the answer, we'll go to the next slide, and that's some case studies. Max brought up Rocky Flats, which is an LM's environmental management site that turned to LM as a good case study. I personally have some experience working with LM because there is a site in Oregon that Legacy Management runs that we'll talk about as well. So just sort of trying to figure out where the pieces fit together and then what's our role in it. So let's go to the next slide. I had some fun with Google Earth, and these two little thumbnails, I didn't zoom in or out. So the one on the left is Rocky Flats. The one on the right is Hanford. So that's a sense of scale here. Hanford's bigger. Rocky Flats is about 20,000 acres and 1,500 of that is sort of what we would think of as the Central Plateau, where it's going to be sort of a landfill that's managed by Legacy Management. They had a total of 2 operable units versus the 47 operable units at Hanford. $7 billion in cleanup budget at Rocky Flats, $700 billion at Hanford, so a little bit different. But even that $7 billion cleanup budget has a price tag of $452 million for Legacy Management operation for just 75 years. So it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, but multiply that by 100, and that's what 75 years worth of. That's a lot of money. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah.
Is that today's dollars or?
It was a GAO report from, I think, 2019.
It's 2019 dollars.
I apologize, my slide formatting didn't come out well. Rocky Flats stewardship had cleanup happening between 94 and 2005. Legacy Management took over in 2005, and there's institutional controls to prevent soil disturbance, surface or groundwater use, and activities that could damage landfill covers. They do inspections for the institutional control and sampling of soil groundwater, and they have either quarterly or annual reports depending on what they're monitoring. So it's been 18 years since Legacy Management, and they're still doing quarterly and annual reports. So it's not just the CERCLA 5-year review. There's also, as part of the institutional controls, there's management plans that have different levels of intricacy and reporting requirements as we go. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So that's Rocky Flats in an overview. I'm not an expert on Rocky Flats. Those are the numbers that I could come up with that were closer to Hanford and sort of EM to LM transfer. Oregon has a Legacy Management site. There was a uranium mill that operated in Lakeview, Oregon, and was cleaned up under the Uranium Mill Tailings Remediation Activities Act. I'm sure. Yeah. So we have a reviewing authority over the scope of work with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the mine operated from the mines and mill operated from the late 50s to late 70s, and remediation was completed in the late 80s. It cost about $25 million. Same trick with Google Earth. Now we're looking at Rocky Flats versus Lakeview, so way smaller, but I couldn't get a Lakeview to Hanford comparison. It was like 1 pixel. Our current activities involve an annual inspection of the 16-acre disposal cell. There's an institutional control in the area of the former mill that stops new groundwater wells from being constructed in a certain zone, a certain aquifer layer. There's groundwater monitoring that happens every 2 to 4 years. And the cell was designed for 1,000 years. But Legacy Management acknowledges that their responsibility for the safety and integrity of this Lakeview disposal cell will last indefinitely. So let's think about that. We've got this really small site, 16 acres. It was $25 million to remediate, and it's an infinite budget because it will last indefinitely. So just a sense of scale here. I'm a geologist, so I like thinking long term. And when we're talking 75 years, $250 million for 75 years at Rocky Flats, 75 years is not very long. We're talking thousands of years of monitoring these sites. So I guess the question then is, where does that leave Oregon?
But Tom, let me add one thing though, is just in terms of this continuing on and on and on for years. There were personnel changes within the agencies.
Absolutely.
And had Oregon, had Tom, Department of Energy, not been proactive, we'd have been left out.
Yep.
Just because people change, don't understand what happened. And I can see that happening again and again and again.
So I've been on this job for a little over 4.5 years, and I am now the senior most person on the Lakeview sites. All of the other folks have turned over, and I will say Legacy Management did a really good job at bringing the new manager up to speed and being, having conversations about what do you know and where can we find the stuff we need to know to get on the speed. And they have had the same contract to do their work, so there is some continuity. And institutional knowledge is being transferred. So that gives me some hope. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Hey, this one worked. So my concept of what Oregon will be doing at Hanford for the next 100 years plus. So if Rocky Flats does quarterly reports and has sampling plans and has annual reports, I think there's probably going to be someone at Odo reading those reports and commenting on them to make sure that the river is being protected. It might not be a staff of 6, but it's going to be somebody on behalf of the state talking to DOE and EPA. We're going to be still informing the public about the risks at Hanford. There's still going to be people doing whatever's happening in 100 years, whether it's phones or tapping your head or something, and talking, asking if it's safe to eat the food that's coming out of the river, and the answer is going to be yes. Hopefully not. Because of Hanford, hopefully not something else happened.
We move fast food.
Right, we move fast food. And then collaborating with the TP agencies and tribal governments to review the stuff that's coming out on the periodic nature, and making sure that Oregon's voice is heard and that the Columbia is being protected. And that is a extremely high level view of what happened this morning. And there's so many unknowns that I didn't want to go into too many weeds, but yeah.
The big weed is, climate change, and the Lakeview mines came perilously close to wildfires, or wildfires came
The mines themselves got the wildfire passed over them.
But this time.
Yeah.
There was also a fire in the Yakima Delta in the same year, close for comfort. I mean, I think that climate change really gets factored in, and it's hard to do because it's an unknown, but it's here, it's happening.
Well, I'll tell you, I was watching the wildfires go closer and closer to the uranium mines, not the mill tailings where the stockpile is, but the actual mine sites themselves are under CERCLA. And EPA and Oregon Department of Environmental Quality are leads on that, and we're involved because there's radionuclides involved. So I was calling my partners at EPA and DEQ. He was like, "Hey, are you guys watching this fire? It's going in the right direction." And by the time they made the first fire map, it had already passed over the mines. And so that's on the Forest Service land, and within a week they were out there. They had inspected the wells. Everything was still safe. The boat that the contractors used to sample the ponds had melted. And there was a big shadow, like a fire shadow on the ground of where the boat had been. It was pretty intense. But yeah, fires are real. Climate change is real. Erosion's real. We're looking at these institutional controls. Some of them are, don't dig. The top 15 feet are clean and below that's dirty. So don't dig 15 feet. Well, who's making sure that the wind isn't eroding the top 5 feet? And then really it's a 10-foot buffer. Are we doing survey controls? And that's where something they did at the mill tailings pile a couple of years ago is they installed these concrete platforms with grid on them. And so they did a LiDAR survey by drone. LiDAR is some
laser interferometer,
or
something or other.
Yeah, so they shoot a bunch of lasers at the ground and then measure how fast they reflect. And from that, you can get a really, really clear picture of the ground surface. And they're going to do that every 5 or 10 years to make sure that the landfill itself isn't slumping to the level that you can't see when you do your annual inspection. So, is Hanford going to have a geosynchronous satellite over it, constantly doing a LiDAR survey and saying, "Oh, look, there's a landslide over the cover over T plant."
You would have said 15 years ago that the drone, like that technology would be ludicrous.
Right.
And now it's just an everyday thing. So an Arduino satellite above Hanford is not out of the question.
I mean, when you're looking at budgets of $470 million for a smaller site for 75 years. How long does a satellite last? Maybe 50, 100 years, and maybe it's worth spending $1 billion on a satellite to do the monitoring.
Tom, you mentioned that rivers have a tendency to meander.
Yeah.
Has any modeling been done on the Hanford Reach?
Yes, I found a study a couple of years ago, and I'd have to dig it up, that estimated like 40 millimeters a year.
To the north or the south?
Oh, so, rivers tend to cut when they're, so they cut on this side and deposit on this side. So when you're going like this, cutting here, when you're going like that, they're cutting here. So, the horn will be growing, and coming into the horn, you'll be cutting sort of across and maybe an oxbow, system, but, the Columbia is pretty well, it'll take a lot of time to erode the rocks. Not that it won't happen, but to get to the Central Plateau, it could be that there's no radionuclides left by the time the river gets there.
That's like the most reassuring thing I've heard all day.
Now an ice age flood would, completely change that.
That's a good point.
And, when you think of, when the last ice age was, 18,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, and, that's within some of the contaminant that is in the landfill.
Or White Bluffs could slump,
Mm.
there could be backup, and the river could jump to the old riverbed.
The old river channel, which goes through the Gable Gap and over the sea farm.
Yeah.
That's not gonna happen though, because there's been significant uplift since then. But yeah, during the, right after the Cascade, right after the Lake Missoula floods, the river channel was going through Gable Gap. And that's why, a lot of the contaminants under sea farm go straight down, because there's not a lot of silts to spread out. So not as much concern about lateral flow under sea farm because of that.
Is that the first time you've learned that the Columbia River ran through in between Gable Butte, Gable Mountain? Lorraine could probably speak to this better than I, but I had learned too that the native name for Gable Mountain and Gable Butte is Nookshee or river otter. Say it again. Nookshee, river otter. So, the stories that how it was named as a river otter because of, so stories are important. I won't mess it up next time.
Well, and isn't the Rattlesnake Mountain, isn't the translation like land above water or something?
Yeah, the leak.
Yeah, the leak is land above water, so. And Rattlesnake Mountain was above the floods 10,000 years or 12,000 years ago.
The technology aspect is a good part of this, the what you're talking about here, and sort of the future of Hanford cleanup is advancements in technology and how those technologies can be employed and used on the site. This got me, we were just at a lunchtime kind of thinking about what our next board meeting might entail, and maybe a